Hi everyone and welcome back. Today is quite a special day because today I'll be telling you a story about the live audio µDAC, an R2R DAC that sells just under $1,000. A special day, but what do you mean by that, Sando? Well, if you checked my LAiV Harmony DAC that I have posted a few months ago, and if you remember my conclusions to that review, then you should know that this one uses absolutely the same R2R modules, the same FPGA processing, and very similar measurements if you care about such things. We no longer have that beautiful remote control, we no longer have that over-engineered power supply, we no longer have RCA outputs because this is only a balanced-only DAC, but we have a very similar sound at a much more affordable price. So let's check it out in the usual fashion. The LAiV Harmony DAC impressed the hell out of me, even starting with the unboxing experience. But when I arrived at the unit itself, I realized that the attention to the smallest details and the overall build quality of the unit is pretty much unmatched at that point, even today. And I can say the same thing about the µDAC. It's much smaller, obviously, but the attention to the smallest details and overall build quality of the unit is pretty much the same. As you can see, we have just one single plate. Everything else is carved from a single piece of aluminum. Of course, we have this much smaller metallic feet with rubber inlays, so everything is much smaller. This knob right here, the buttons, but overall the build quality is very similar, so it's very high. In the end, LAiV Audio didn't economize much on the µDAC, getting a similar build quality in a much smaller body. Checking out its controls, we have the on-off button right here. We have the digital selector in the form of a volume wheel, but of course this is just a digital selector. We have the menu navigator right here that lets you select I2S configuration, the brightness of the screen, oversampling, non-oversampling mode, and many other things. And of course we have the select button on the lower part of its front panel. Although it's incredibly small, as you can see on its back, we have four of the most important digital inputs: I2S, coaxial, optical, and USB. We have just a single pair of XLR outputs. These are fixed. This one is not providing you a volume control, so just 4 volts output. And if you need an RCA output, you can of course buy separately a pair of XLR to RCA converters. This one is powered by DC power by 15 volts and 2 amperes, so in total 30 watts. You can use the external power supply, you can use some other third-party, maybe linear power supply, so it's really up to you. We have a decently sized display, so this one uses a 25 by 7 dot LCD matrix. You have 3 brightness levels, and if it bothers you in long listening sessions, then you can disable it completely. The lettering is quite big, and I could read it from my comfy armchair across the room, so yeah, this part is covered, so this is good. Let's talk about some of the tech that is powering the µDAC. But first of all, I want to address the elephant in the room, which I believe is this external switching mode power supply that is coming with the µDAC. It doesn't look so impressive, but if you want to change this one, if you want to use an external linear power supply, you can do that. Just make sure to use to output 15 volts and at least 2 amperes. It could be 3 amperes or more. And of course, it should have a 5.5mm DC barrel. I have used this one with an external linear power supply. It's an overkill Kisses P14. I don't recommend that one. It's too big and too powerful for this one. And yes, it sounded better, but not much better as I have hoped. But more about that in a minute. I believe it already has an impressive voltage regulation stage and also a filtering stage. So with that power supply, a few things were better, but the noise and distortion were not improving with a linear power supply. So meaning this is already good enough in my book. The second part of the power supply, however, can be found inside the µDAC. The DC filtering stage is quite impressive. So even with the stock power supply, the noise floor is non-audible and distortion always seems to be in check. The next stage is voltage regulation that will power every circuit inside the µDAC. Unfortunately, a lot of them are located on the other side of the PCB, and if you want to know how that looks, you might want to check Alvin's video he posted a few days ago. I will leave his video in the description box below. The next comes the digital side. We have a digital receiver, the FPGA chip, and 2 femtosecond clocks from µDAC, which by the way could be found in much more expensive DACs. The FPGA, which LAiV Audio programmed with their own code, is sending the signal to those shiny R2R ladder modules, and yes, those are the same modules you can find in the LAiV Harmony DAC, which is almost 3 times the price of the µDAC. One of the most important part of DAC design, I believe, is the analog output stage. It needs to be over-engineered, it needs to have some discrete components, it needs to be biased in Class A operation, and you know what, we have all of that in the µDAC. So this part is actually very good, makes me happy, because the soul of the music and the tone and the timbre and the musicality, all of that is coming not only from the R2R modules but also from the analog output stage, because that is the last part that is coming into your amplifier. So the handshake is done with the analog output stage with your amplifier. Okay everyone, this is pretty much it, so let's hit some eardrums and let's check how this one is performing. First of all, I want to start this review with a big disclaimer. I try hard to be as objective and as neutral as possible in my reviews, but as much as I try, all of this hi-fi reviewing thing is actually quite personal, quite subjective. We have different ear shapes, we have different personalities, we like different music styles, so on and so forth. So as much as I try, I need to confess that I like the sound of R2R DACs a little bit more compared to chip-based Delta Sigma solutions, because generally they sound a little bit bigger, they sound much closer to unamplified music, and they just do proper justice to music. I'm not saying that chip-based DACs do not sound great. I just want to highlight that I like the sound of R2R DACs a little bit more, so please take that into consideration. Do note that I've tested tens of R2R DACs by now, and I can differentiate what is mediocre, what is good, what is great. And I do believe that the LAiV µDAC is a great sounding unit at this price for a couple of reasons. And let me address all of those individually. The first reason, and probably the most important reason, I observed one very interesting effect lately actually. When everything is clicking into place and when you like what you are hearing, then your body is reacting in quite an interesting way. It puts you in a very relaxed, almost sleepy state. The sound is so real and so relaxed that I no longer want to open my eyes, just sit there, be one with the sofa and just listen to music for a couple of hours and enjoy the moment in a semi-sleepy state. This is what happens on the µDAC, especially if I engage my jazz and blues collection. Secondly is the tone and timbre of the music. This part is so incredibly hard to render by chip-based Delta Sigma DACs, but it's a child's play on R2R DACs, and I really don't understand what part is making them so lush, sweet and organic sounding, but even in oversampling mode, so even not touching that non-oversampling mode, these are sounding so much richer and fuller compared to chip-based solutions, and again, I don't understand why. My reference DAC, as I told you before, is also an R2R DAC, which is considerably more expensive to this one, and that one has absolutely the same tonality, very rich, very full-bodied, sweet sounding, and this one is very similar, and that makes me quite happy. When it needs to put a lot of emotion back into your music, it will do so without asking for your permission, and when it needs to be clear and defined, it will do so immediately. So again, this part is quite interesting on the µDAC. The third part, which I like quite a lot on the µDAC, is that this one is sweet, juicy, it's rich sounding, but without becoming overly smooth or overly mellow. So this one is not slowing down those dynamics. This one is not slowing down the transient response like what I've heard on the third generation Denafrips Aries. That one was actually quite a disappointment in terms of transients. I couldn't listen to electronica music. It was skipping a bit, skipping a few notes, and that part I didn't like. Something that the µDAC is not doing. So yes, I can listen to electronica music. I find it quite snappy, punchy, and alive, and I believe that switching mode power supply has something to do with this kind of sound. The µDAC is not slowing down my tunes, it's not hitting the brakes in terms of dynamics, and yes, even electronica sounds snappy on this one. The fourth part which I like about the µDAC is that it shows me the depth of the music a little bit nicer compared to the Centaurus DAC by Topping, which is also an R2R DAC at a very similar price point. The holography effects are also stronger on the µDAC. The scale of the music is nicer, so it can sound a little bit bigger, and that is actually a very big deal because this one is smaller, I mean the physical size compared to the Topping Centaurus, and yet the sound can be a little bit bigger and a little bit airier. So if I listen to some old blues records, for example, the sound is much closer to my face, it's cozier, so everything is happening real near me. And if I'm listening to some live orchestral work like classical music or big orchestras, then the sound is simply bigger on the Harmony DAC as well. So it knows how to place with the scale, with the soundstage, a little bit nicer compared to Centaurus. And this part I again don't quite understand because it's smaller, but I believe that the output stage, which is nicer compared to that of the Centaurus DAC, is doing these tricks, you know, playing a little bit with the soundstage, with the depth, holography, with the air in between the notes. So this one is actually very impressive in this regard. The fifth and the last reason why I believe the µDAC is quite impressive is that the micro level information doesn't seem to be missing as how it was the case with all the generation R2R DAC. So if this part is important to you, then you should know that this one is pretty much on the same level with LAiV Harmony DAC, and even more impressive compared to Topping Centaurus, but more about that in a minute. So yes, it's quite resolving, there is plenty of information on the micro scale, and yes, in this regard it's very similar to the Harmony DAC. That one is more dynamic, that one sounds a little bigger, but when it comes to sheer resolution and detail retrieval, these two brothers are pretty much similar. The amount of information pushed forward is substantial, and while it's a bit lower compared to, say, a Delta Sigma DAC at a similar price point, this information is much more pleasing to the ear, never trying to offend with harsh trebles in long listening sessions. Some of you are wondering how much you can improve the sound of the µDAC by using an external linear power supply. And that's exactly what I did, but do note this is an overkill one. I do not recommend you getting this one specifically for the µDAC. This one has 4 DC outputs, it has 2 huge transformers, lots of capacitance, it's really overkill for the µDAC. But if you want to get something similar, you can go with the Keysys P3, which provides also 15 volts and 2 amperes, and I do believe that one will sound very similar with the µDAC. The sound improvements were there, but not as much as I hoped. Sincerely, I hoped it will do a little bit more. So in terms of holography, soundstage, how big was the scale of the music? I've heard an improvement of around 15% at best. It was slightly bigger and airier, but not by a lot. Also, dynamics improved by around 10%, and it's really hard to choose these numbers to quantify how much improvement I've heard, but I would say 10% in terms of dynamics. The sound was a little bit punchier and a little bit stronger, weightier, but not by much. And that was pretty much it. The weird part is that distortion and noise floor didn't go down as I have hoped. It remained pretty much the same, meaning that the switching mode power supply is already good enough. And also don't forget that the biggest part of the power supply is not located here, but here in the µDAC, the voltage regulation stage and also the filtering stage. So it's here, and I believe it's good enough. So if you want a slight improvement, you can go with a pricey linear transformer power supply. If you don't want, I believe that the stock one is already good enough. Last but not least, I decided to compare the Topping Centaurus R2R DAC that costs $999 with the LAiV micro DAC that goes for $994, so very similar. First of all, I say that the build quality is nicer on the LAiV micro DAC. It's actually quite a big improvement. Everything is carved from a single block of aluminum. Also, the plates are much thicker. The attention to the smallest details is much nicer on the LAiV. So I'd say that overall the build quality and unboxing experience and everything that has to do with the build quality and looks, it's more impressive on the LAiV micro DAC. When it comes to features, this is where the Topping Centaurus is winning quite a lot. So we have a colorful display with that VU meter and FFT spectrum. It can output 4 or 5 volts via XLR, and we also have RCA outputs with 2 or 2.5 volts via RCA. You won't need XLR adapters on the Centaurus, and you can also lower the volume working as a passive preamp with the included remote control. You can enable a parametric EQ function, and overall it's more feature-packed, and I see a lot of value with the Topping. It's still a great unit no matter what. When it comes to the sound, I would say that these two units are more similar than different. I believe that they sound truly like very good R2R DACs, but still there are quite a few notable changes when closely assessing their sound. First and the biggest change was in terms of depth, holography and scale, but more in terms of depth, I'd say. With the micro DAC, I could feel that a few sounds were much closer to me and a few sounds were much deeper into the room, something that felt a little more compressed sounding on the Centaurus DAC. The distance between these notes were not so great on the Centaurus, and it was bigger and greater on the micro DAC, so it was playing with my imagination a little bit nicer, the micro DAC, and it was a little bit flatter sounding on the Centaurus DAC. This is the biggest difference that I could say in between these two units. Secondly, the rendition of the treble and of the mid-range is a little bit different. For example, the treble on the micro DAC is a little bit more defined. It's not sharper, but it's clearer, and I could but hear its trail a little bit nicer on the micro DAC. I'd say it's a little bit more detailed sounding compared to the Centaurus DAC, a little bit more information in that upper register, and also the mid-range seems to be awakening a little bit more emotion. I'd say it's a little bit richer, sweeter, call it as you want, but definitely a little bit more emotion emanating from the mid-range region, like the vocals, string-based instruments, all those air instruments are simply weeping with more emotion on the micro DAC and not so much on the Topping. I'd say that that fully discrete output stage is doing some mambo jumbo on the micro DAC and not so much on the Topping. Maybe I'm wrong, but definitely there is a little bit more life in the mid-range and a little bit more detail in the upper treble. Dynamics are pretty much on the same level, and transients as well, and overall the technical performance is very similar on these two devices. So overall I'd say that with the LAiV micro DAC a stronger bond with my music could be felt. It's more engaging, it's richer, it's fuller bodied, it's a little sweeter, there is a stronger contrast, the colors are popping more on the micro DAC, and all of that is a little bit not so colorful, not so rich, not so powerful on the Topping Centaurus. So it really depends on what part is more important to you, the feature set, the parametric equalizer, and also volume control, remote control, or a much stronger bond with your music. So it really depends on who you are and what you value most. Wrapping up, I'm happy with the performance of the LAiV micro DAC, even if we don't get a flash display or some features that I'm not going to use. The interesting part is not getting a highly entertaining sound, but a sound that is so close to the LAiV Harmony DAC. So the live audio house sound is very strong in this one, and that can be felt from the first seconds of play. So it's undeniably the same sound I've heard on the Harmony DAC, emphasizing a strong connection with your music collection, rather than offering an immaculate technical performance. To my surprise, the sound didn't improve as much as I hoped with an external linear power supply, like it was the case with the 5R7, suggesting that the voltage regulation and voltage filtering is already good enough in the stock form, so this is already a good part. Considering that I'm dealing with a DAC that costs less than $1,000 and sounds this way, it's really complicated complaining about anything really. So the micro DAC is definitely not about getting some perfect measurements, but about getting a highly entertaining sound that makes me emotional. And if this part is important to you, then I can wholeheartedly recommend to you the micro DAC. Okay guys, this is pretty much it. Please consider liking and subscribing if you found this video helpful. My next video will be for a live UDDC that will be dropping in a few days. Until that happens, keep your chin up and I'll see you very soon. Cheers!